Hey guys, I'm Yuruzi. This is part 2 of What If Naruto Grew Up with a Pack of Demons. Growing up with a pack of demons is easy, especially when the older he gets, the more a demon Naruto becomes. But when the pack is killed by shinobi, Naruto vows revenge by learning to use his ever-growing chakra. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel and check out the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 6, Brothers of Blood. Sunny landed gracefully amongst the pack and headed straight for Crick, eager to show off the new necklace. The leader was crouched quietly under a tree staring silently at nothing. The pack usually did that. Crick! Look what I got from a strange human. Crick lifted his head and stared at the necklace. What? He straightened his body and stood up. There should be no humans here, he said as he snatched the necklace from Sunny's fingers and sniffed it. This has the source. You came across a human with the source? How far from here was it? Sunny shrank away, red eyes darting to the others. Well, it didn't threaten me. Crick growled angrily and moved to swat the demon child away, but Sunny leaped into the trees, inadvertently landing near Zorn, who grabbed his small ankle and hung him upside down. Now was his chance. Sunny twisted his body and clawed at Zorn's thick wrist, his own nails hardening to suit the situation. Zorn hissed in pain and released the demon child, but quickly leaped from the tree to follow the youth to the forest floor. Just before Sunny's body connected with the dirt, he twisted around and looked up at the descending demon. His red eyes flashed, and bursting from the ground came two large clawed hands, the size of Zorn's torso, sailing past the small youth's body and gripping the larger demon around the ribs. Zorn howled as the source hands connected with his flesh and immediately began to burn on contact. He tried to twist his body away, tried to release himself from the massive hands, but the burning grip was already crushing his sturdy ribs. Sunny landed on the floor with one arm and leg and managed to swiftly leap out of the way as Zorn and his source hands came crashing down. The twigs and branches that had made the descent with them caught fire when they were touched by the angry source, and joined by the sizzling of the writhing Zorn's flesh. Zorn crashed to the ground and screamed as his flesh began to peel back and crumble as the hands tightened their grip. Sunny stood up and bounced in malicious glee as Zorn writhed in pain. It was almost as if the hands were his actual limbs, as if he were grasping the older demon himself. He could feel Zorn's skin crunch. A shadow thumped to his side and Crick grabbed his arm viciously. Son! Stop this immediately! He violently shook the youth, making Sunny's head snap back and forth and his arm, which was held within his large hand, pop out of his shoulder. Sunny gave a small grunt, but the source hands released Zorn with a red puff, covering the area in a crimson miasma. Zorn gave a weak whimper as he attempted to crawl away into the bushes. The flesh had been burned down to the bone so that one could see his ribs and spine. Look at what you've done to your brother! He bellowed, continuously shaking the youth so that his teeth rattled and his dislocated arm began to swell at the continued abuse. You never attack your pack with the source. Do you hear me, son? Never. Answer me. Sunny glared up into his enraged yellow eyes, and for a second Crick saw something else in them. He saw the master, with his burning hatred and love for carnage. He felt its fury beneath the surface, and for a moment braced himself for those dreadful hands to be turned on him. But as suddenly as it came, it drained away, turning his eyes to such a blue he almost gasped. Whenever Sunny was feeling a particularly strong emotion that wasn't hate or anger, his eyes tended to revert back to their original color before the change. Sunny's now blue eyes deadened, and the boy slumped toward the dirt, his arm protesting as Crick held him up by the now swollen appendage. Sunny's pain tolerance never failed to surprise him. Seeing that the youth was taking his chastisement seriously, Crick released his arm and let the boy flop lifelessly into the dirt. He then turned his attention to his moaning brother. Spate and Chakra hovered over him as he sat hunched in the debris, yellow eyes clouded in pain. Occasionally Chakra would lick the raw meat on his back in a joint attempt to speed along the healing and to soothe his wounded sibling. Crick sighed. It had been a long time since one of them had been hurt this badly. He glanced back at Sunny, who remained as he had left him, lying on the ground as if he were dead. Crick turned back to his siblings. How long do you estimate for that to heal? He asked Chakra, for he was always one to catalog things like time and place. Chakra frowned. The damage is severe, but it will heal in a few days, no more than 4. We shouldn't move him much though, and I fear it will be a very painful healing process. Crick rolled his shoulders in agitation and allowed himself a moment to decide. If the human with the source had given the trinket to Sunny, it must be an overture of friendship. Sunny had that effect on some humans. It was dangerous to remain here, and yet, they should not move Soren for at least 4 days. Crick scowled. We'll have to stay here then, until he heals. I'll go check the perimeter to make sure there are no humans nearby. He turned and passed by Sunny, whose eyes had begun to glaze over. He was half on his stomach and half on his side. Crick grumbled and moved on. This was just another familiar technique Sunny pulled when he was in trouble. Crick vaguely wondered how long the boy would lay there. I'm the one constantly in pain, and he's moping around. This is ridiculous. Make the wretch get up and apologize. Tka sighed and glanced down at the blonde demon laying covered in leaves and dirt. Sunny had not moved, or so much as twitched in the last 3 days. Most of Soren's flesh had been repaired, though he complained constantly about the burning, to the point that Spate stopped caring and had taken to sneering at him behind his back. Spate dropped from a tree and walked over to the prone Sunny, sniffing him over and nudging his still dislocated shoulder. Why hasn't that healed already? He asked with a frown. Tka lifted his head from his spot under a tree and glanced listlessly at the two. His arm has been pulled out of his shoulder, he replied dryly. It must be popped back in by an outside source. Don't fix it, you fool, Soren snapped from where he sat, eyes glaring hatefully at the dirty child. Make him suffer, like I am. Spate lifted his head from Sunny's shoulder and seemed to puff up in indignation. You're the one being ridiculous. You forget how young Sunny is. He's just a baby. He isn't even a decade old yet. And you're the one acting like a child. You're almost healed, get over it already. You're just pissed because he one-upped you. Tka lifted his head in surprise, and immediately silenced Soren when he opened his mouth to retort. You are right. Sunny is just a child. And he is not of our blood, he is not bound to us. Tka stood up. I must speak with Crick. Behave yourselves. You're demons, not animals. With that he leapt into the trees fluidly and disappeared from view. Soren grunted and turned his back on the other two, while Spate nudged Sunny's damaged shoulder, which had now turned a beautiful black and purple, colors Spate felt looked good against Sunny's golden skin. 2 hours later he returned with Crick, who looked uneasy and distracted. There's a group of humans not far from here, all with the source. They are heading in this direction, perhaps they sensed Sunny's source, Tka spoke in a rush. We must leave quickly, but first we must bind Sunny to us. Son! Come here. Crick called in a commanding voice. As if he hadn't spent the last 3 days playing dead, Sunny's head lifted from the dirt, eyes red and alert, fixed on Crick. Immediately he jumped to his feet, twisted then popped his arm in place, then scampered over to the others. Then he felt them, far off, but coming close, humans with the source. His sharp ears began to pick up the sound of their breaths, the beat of their footfalls as they moved along. The sky grumbled, the clouds clashed and the air smelled of the rain to come. Crick captured his attention and spoke in rush. The humans coming this way are powerful, too powerful for you to fight, he said quickly as Sunny opened his mouth. We're going to split from you, but first we must bond you to us. Make you our brother in blood. Sunny's eyes widened as he watched the others run a claw against their palms, drawing their blood. Quickly he ran his index claw over his right-hand palm, then jumped when Crick grabbed it, pressing his cut against his own, then thrusting his hand to the others, who quickly grabbed his palm. It was all so quick, and gave him the sense that if done under other circumstances, it would be an honorary moment. But danger was near, and the cut was beginning to heal. Then awareness hit him even as Crick grabbed his previously damaged arm and took to the trees. He could feel them, their blood running through his veins, their minds opening to him. He felt such a closeness that was unlikely to be felt outside the womb. And for that brief moment, he was content, he was complete, all was right with the world, as if so much had been wrong and his eyes had been opened to it. Then Crick stopped on a branch as the others continued on, and spun Sunny to him. Sunny, listen to me. Now that you are bonded to us, don't look away. He grabbed Sunny's head in his massive hands when Sunny made attempt to look behind them. You are one of us by blood now. And as your leader, you must obey me. Sunny's eyes widened. You must not use the source right now, Sunny. They will follow us, you understand? You must get as far from here and hide. Sunny tried to shake his head in Crick's massive grip and then tried to pull away from him, but Crick's grip tightened and his yellow eyes began to glow. "I order you to do as I say. You must not follow us. We will find you later." Crick allowed Sunny to pull his face from his hands as the first drops fell from the sky. Sunny stepped back from him, eyes incredulous at the stir in his blood, the stir that told him to do as his leader commanded. "Go!" Crick quietly as the humans neared. Sunny turned, but never took his eyes from Crick. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. Crick turned to follow his brothers. The rain began to fall like a sheet of gray. Were the skies already morning? 2 miles to the south, Sunny stopped and looked back to the way he had come, his body slick with the pouring rain, hair plastered to his flesh. He did not like Crick's words that had felt final. He didn't like how he suddenly had to do as Crick said, not that he didn't always do that anyway. But Crick had a power over him that on one side, pleased him, and on the other, grated his nerves. He had always wondered why Zorn never picked up and left on his own if he didn't like Crick so much, but now he understood. Zorn didn't have a choice. A flash before his eyes, Sunny jerked his head back with a gasp, and the echo of pain that was not his. Sunny's eyes widened. Through his new connection, he began to catch glimpses of what was happening with his brothers. There was a flash, he saw Spate's severed arm, saw a human throw something sharp that spun and dug into his shoulder. He saw the cryptic hand movements from another human, and gave a small scream of horror as a thick bolt of lightning hit Spate as Chakra leaped to his aid. They were being slaughtered. His pack. Sunny raced forward, putting the source into his legs to increase his speed. He would get there in time. As he made the leap from one tree to another, something snapped in his mind, then a sense of immense loss, causing him to miss his step and crash down into the mud. Sunny gripped his head and cried out in despair. Spate was dead. The connection to him was gone. Sunny pulled himself to his feet, wailing all the while as he staggered in a weak attempt to make it to his brothers. He could not focus on the source, could not pull it to his feet like he had done before. He could only run in their direction, hoping that he would arrive in time to save his pack. Branches lashed into him, the rain pounded at his body, but he moved on, feeling waves of sickness hit him from many sides. Someone was in pain, then another. Flashes of earth, flashes of thick vines covered in dagger-like thorns, digging into his neck, no, Etka's neck. Sunny ran head-on into a tree, staggered back and fell into the mud, head spinning, eyes unfocused. Then his ears picked up a bombardment of screams. He could hear the familiar roar of Crick and the screech of Zorn. Sunny crawled to the clearing, eyes rolling in their sockets before falling on the scene. There were 5 humans, 4 standing and 1 crumpled at Crick's feet, half of its skull missing. Nearby lay Spate, his body smoking and blackened. Chakra lay not 2 feet from him, immersed in thick vines, head severed from his body. There was a look of resignation still pasted on his features, like this all had been expected and unavoidable. Sunny rocked back on his heels, face frozen in a mask of horror. The humans had formed a circle around the remaining demons. Zorn lay slumped near Crick, body embedded with sharp metal objects. There was a large hole on the left side of Crick's chest, and he was making attempts to protect Zorn. Sunny made to run to his aid, but Crick saw him, his pain-filled eyes held one command. Stay! The humans put their hands together, made strange movements and yelled a strange string of words together in unison. A wave of source blew over him, and Sunny watched in horror as the very ground soared up over 50 feet in the air, hovered for a moment before making its descent down upon the 2 demons. Crick's eyes never left his. The battle had been going their way, the demons didn't know any jutsu, didn't seem to have chakra period. One was already wounded apparently, from what they did not know, but they found they did not have to worry much. These were minor creatures, not like the bijou that was often a village's worst nightmare. These were easily dealt with, they were umbu after all. The demons were fast though, quick, and had demonstrated how powerful a hit could be. One hit to the head had killed Yoshiru, a valued member of the team. A Raiton Justa had taken down one of them, a good Doton for the other. In the end they decided to crush the other 2, end a battle that should not have seen casualty on their side. The mud crashed down on the 2 demons, immediately crushing the slumped one, but knocking the one that stood over Yoshiru, crushing its body and causing its eyes to pop out of its skull. Then it was done. They had tracked these demons over 2 continents and had lost 1 comrade. The Nin stood in the rain, staring at the head of the demon, and at the place where Yoshiru lay covered. Off to the side, Takizo stood, eyes wide, kunai in hand. The man had finally gotten what he wanted. Vengeance is dash. Kitaro's words were cut short as an ear-splitting wail came from the forest. Ninja spun, eyes alert, then shocked as a muddy child with the bluest eyes they had ever seen came running towards them, arms out in supplication as he passed then and dropped to his knees before the demon's head. The wailing continued in the way only a child's could, without reserve, without shame. Strange sounds came from his lips, words impossible to say with a human mouth, and the child bent over the head, burying its face into the top of the skull. Who? Muragi questioned and took a step toward the child. Before he came to his side, the child leaped up and began to dig through the mound of mud, as if to find the bodies, all the while sobbing uncontrollably, tears and rain streaking down his face. Frantic eyes found them, and there was such accusation in his eyes, that Takizo flinched and looked away. Keitaro did not flinch. But his eyes widened. Jinchuriki! He hissed, and the others immediately readied themselves with what might be their final battle if this was a powerful one. But the child seemed to forget them, instead grabbing at its rain-slickened hair and burying its face in the mud, muffling his screams. It was the kind of grief that made people vomit, or pass out, such as the child was behaving, on his knees with his face in the mud. We should go, Takizo whispered, looking away from the grieving child. We should go. Keitaro glanced at Muragi, whom was nursing a crushed arm, eyes riveted on the weeping child. We'll tend to our wounds, come. Let us leave the child to his business. Muragi lifted his head, then grimaced, holding his arm in pain. What about the Jinchuriki? Keitaro shook his head. Leave him. He's not part of the mission. What about Yoshiro? Keitaro turned and began to walk toward the woods for cover. Leave him. We'll get him when we're healed. He nodded to their medic Nin, who looked like she wanted to comfort the still grieving child. Leave him, Keed. He'll likely hurt you if you touch him. The medic Nin nodded and went to Muragi to assess his wounds. Takizo was last to leave the battlefield, eyes lingering on the child, who was now rocking back and forth, moaning audibly over the onslaught of rain. The eyes were a devastating blue. The child was quite beautiful actually. But he knew what a Jinchuriki was, knew that this was really a demon in disguise. So why were his tears so human? Chapter 7, Defeat and Despair. The torrent of rain finally stopped its onslaught of rain a few hours after the battle, allowing the drenched and healed shinobi to slip from their makeshift shelters. Moving toward the site of the battle, they grimaced at the sight of the Jinchuriki child, who sat atop the mound of mood, face reddened by the strain of his own grief. What do we do now? Takizo whispered while Keed approached Keitaro. Captain, it's just a child, she murmured. Perhaps if we showed compassion, this may not come to blows. Keitaro tensed. I doubt that, he replied grimly, jerking his head toward the demon child. The child lifted its head, face set in misery, blue eyes falling upon them. The small body stiffened, the pretty blue eyes began to turn a deep purple, then an angry red, the pupils thinning and becoming cat-like slits. The child moved to his knees and crawled sinuously down the mound, his small childlike body moving with such grace that it almost seemed bizarre. Shit, Keed hissed as the child's hands touched the soaked ground and then his feet. The child stood up, remained in a slight crouch, then became still. Takizo, please stay out of the way, Keitaro ordered calmly, and saw the man back away toward the foliage, yet remaining in sight. The Jinchuriki's eyes shifted toward the man then back at them. It was the moment before a deadly battle, a standstill, when each opponent is waiting to see who would make the first move. But the child was so still, like he was carved from marble. He had never seen a living thing become so immobile, and yet the tension was thick enough to shave with. Do you feel that? Muragi gasped suddenly, and then he became aware of it. He had been mistaken. It was not tension that he felt but chakra, so much chakra that his ears began to pop with the pressure. His eyes trained on the boy with a new light, he began to see a slightly reddish haze begin to flow around the motionless child. The boy seemed to be gathering chakra. What kind of bijou rested within him? Was this battle really worth it? There was a twitch of his facial muscles, the first movement the boy allowed, then the attack came. The ground exploded beneath them, tossing the shinobi into the air like rag dolls. Quickly they controlled their fall, only to gasp at the sight of two large red chakra hands reaching out to grab Muragi, who quickly performed a kawamari as the chakra gripped his leg. Immediately he popped into a log, and as the hands gripped it, they watched grimly as the log caught fire then was crushed in the powerful grip. Keitaro landed gracefully on his feet, attention riveted on the angry Jinchuriki, and was surprised to see the startled look on the demon child's face. The child's red eyes seemed momentarily fixated on the smoldering pieces of logwood before they fell on him. The child bared teeth, showing sharp incisors. But there was fear along with the rage. Had the boy never seen a basic jutsu before? Something even an academy student could do? He remembered when he saw his first displacement jutsu, how awed he was and excited to learn. And yes, he also remembered the fear. Keitaro ran his eyes over the child's body. No muscle tone, no calluses, the boy seemed feral with no ninja training to go with all that chakra. This should be as easy a win as the others. Muragi, who had settled in the nearby trees, must have come to the same conclusion and quickly performed the seals for shadow clones, summoning 40 of them onto the battlefield. A flustered look passed over the demon's face and he spun in a circle as the 40 Muragi shadow clones surrounded him. The chakra hands that had been occupied with trying to grab Kid hesitated and stilled. Keitaro took his opportunity and threw several kunai at the youth, and was actually surprised as they hit their mark, sinking into the child's back. The child cried out in pain and made an attempt to grab the embedded kunai from his flesh, his face twisted in misery, his eyes changing from their angry red to a dull blue. The chakra hands sank into the earth as the child crouched on his haunches, trying to grab the hilt of the kunai, seemingly having forgot the battle. Assuredly this child had never been in one before, if it completely discarded the battle it was in favor of nursing a wound. Perhaps this child had never fought a human before. And if not, what did that mean? Muragi leaped from the tree, short-bladed katana unsheathed and dropped to the boy's side. Muragi had always been a quick killer, he seemed to favor severing heads from bodies. He was also careless. As he landed at the Jinchuriki's side, the helpless pained look disappeared, the eyes changed back, and with a speed that they had never seen before, slipped behind the shinobi, leaped onto his back, and buried his face into the man's neck. Muragi screamed, dropping his katana in favor of grabbing the child's head. Kid shouted and leaped at the youth, her hands fueled with chakra that would burn upon contact. But the boy pushed off the umbu and soared away from them, landing on all fours, eyes taking them in, body becoming still once again. Kid clutched Muragi before he collapsed to the ground, ready to heal the damage done to his neck. His neck was a bloody mess, and it was hard to see the extent of the damage with Kid's healing hands covering the wound. Keitaro turned his attention to the demon. The child's mouth was smeared with Muragi's blood, and as if just noticing it, a blood-coated tongue slipped from the small lips and swiped at his mouth. For Shuriken soared towards him, reminding Keitaro of the old Mantakizo, and began to perform a simple genjutsu. As Kid worked to heal Muragi's wounds, Keitaro saw the child slap a shuriken out of the air and slink sideways to avoid the rest. This battle was an easy one. The child had chakra, so much of it, but didn't know how to do any jutsu. It had speed and agility, but obviously had never fought humans before. Jinchuriki yes, but still nothing more than a child. The seals were finished, a minor and quick one, made to cause disorientation. It would seem as if the world itself were tilting. He really didn't want to fight this child. He wanted to collect his fallen teammate and go, report to his Kage, and kiss his wife. Sunny sent his source hands toward the stupid human, intending to rend it to bits, when his vision began to swirl, making him drop the source and stagger to his feet, trying to gain equilibrium. The world would not comply. Sunny staggered to the side, tripped over his own foot, and crashed to the muddy ground. He saw one of the humans throw several of the sharp things at him. He surged to his feet, made to dodge them, but apparently went the wrong way as the objects embedded themselves into his stomach and chest. Sunny crashed into a tree behind him, causing the sharp objects in his back to sink in further, one scraping his spine, causing spots of pain to burst up his spine and causing flashy lights to explode behind his eyes. He had lost the fight, he knew, as turned and rushed into the cover of the forest, smacking into trees and tripping over roots, making his wounds worse all the while. The things these humans could do frightened him, turning into logs and then making more of themselves. He had been beaten by humans with the source, just like Crick said he would. The Jinchuriki had run off into the forest, making a wise but noisy retreat. Immediately Keitaro dropped to Kid's side, taking in the damage. "Will you be able to heal him?" Kid shook her head and grunted. "I've already healed the wound." The child missed his artery, only took a piece of flesh off. "But that's not the problem. What is?" the captain asked, spotting the old man as he came to their side, face weary, eyes haunted. I can't seem to fight this infection. Kitaro's attention dropped back to Muragi's neck, though still bloody, seemed healed. Only what looked like an embarrassing black hickey remained. He was bitten 2 minutes ago. Yes, I know. But the bite seems more deadly than that. We need to get him back to the village. Keitaro nodded and stood up. Yoshiru would have to wait. 3 miles east of the shinobi sat a sobbing, bloody, blonde child with 5 metal objects embedded in his back, 2 in his chest, and 1 in his stomach. There was mud caked over most of his small body and blood running from the wounds mixed in with it. But the tears were from emotional pain and not the physical. Crick, Tka, Spate, Soren, they were all gone. Dead. And he was alone. 1 minute he had been fighting with Soren, the next they were dead. It all seemed so unreal that he wouldn't have believed it if he hadn't witnessed the whole thing. And by humans. No less. Sunny gave a gurgling sob as he viciously pulled the metal objects from his stomach and chest, then began to twist around uncomfortably to reach the others. He managed to grab one and pull it out, albeit tilting it so he caused more damage than he wanted. The others came out after more painful twisting and the child sat amongst the instruments of pain, feeling hollow. They were gone. How had those filthy humans found any remaining color drained from his face? Tka had said the humans had sensed his source. His source. He had led them to their deaths. He had paved the path to his own pack's annihilation. Sunny's face scrunched up and he began to pull on his hair again, his tangled feathers falling into the dirt. More tears came as he began to bash his head into the dirt. He should be dead. He should be with the pack right now, a corpse like they were. Sunny stopped banging his head and jumped to his feet, his wounds long since healed, and rammed his fist into the trunk of a nearby tree, hearing the wood splinter as he turned away and glared despairingly into the foliage. He could not bear another moment with this knowledge, could not spend eternity knowing. The sound of the tree crashing down missed his ears as the tree toppled over, one of its thick branches colliding with the top of his skull and sending the child into immediate unconsciousness. The first time in 7 years. Sunny awoke with a start and jumped to his feet, red eyes wide with surprise and confusion. What had just happened? One moment he had been angry, the next getting up off the ground. He glanced at the tree and put 2 and 2 together. Sunny slumped down next to the fallen tree and rubbed his face miserably. He was sad, he was confused, he tipped to his side and rolled into a ball. All he could do was lie there and hope for oblivion. He took a deep breath and became still. Resting wasn't going to come for a few days, but he was content to mimic it. After all, life no longer had any meaning. 2 weeks later. She was embarrassed to say that she had inadvertently become a hermit. How it happened wasn't exactly clear, but at the ripe old age of 62, she was acutely aware that time was no longer on her side. Not that I have anything urgent to do, Mayu thought with a dry chuckle. She had always been fond of nature, and as she had gotten older, had spent more time in the forests, becoming an old wayfarer at the time when she should have been spending her days on some porch somewhere, reminiscing about times past and when her children were young. Maybe she would have, if she had any children. Mayu sighed and pulled some berries off of the thorny plant as she foraged through the forest. The wilderness was no place for an old woman, and she wondered if she should head back to civilization soon. She straightened from her crouch and groaned at the ache in her lower back, which always became stiff when given half the chance. Her small cottage, which had been for fur trapping in its previous life, sat not a mile from her current position, and she wondered if she could make it back before sunset. She hated traveling at night, not because of fear, but because her eyesight wasn't getting any better with age, and the darkness of a forest can be absolute. Mayu placed her basket in the crook of her arm and turned to leave, when she spotted a snake lying nearby. Her heart surged into her throat as she froze in place, then gave a small sigh of relief. It was green, a harmless garden snake, not even poisonous. Mayu put a wrinkled hand to her chest and listened to her thudding heart. She was too old for scares like this, and the receding adrenaline rush was leaving her weak. While she waited for the weakness to pass, she eyed the serpent, and was startled to see that there was a distinct bite taken out of it. Frowning, Mayu crouched down slowly and eyed the wound. The wound must have been recent, for the blood still glistened and the flesh was still pink. But what sent the gray hair on her head on end was the perfect human-shaped bite, as if someone took a chunk out of the serpent then decided that she didn't like the taste. The snake wasn't cooked. Mayu straightened and allowed her eyes to scan the thick foliage of the healthy forest. Was there another person out here, perhaps lost and ravenously hungry? Mayu bit her lip and began to push through some of the bushes, brushing off tumbling spiders as she passed through their webs. Perhaps. Mayu popped into a small clearing and practically yelped at the sight of the small, grungy child that sat on the forest floor. Good Lord, child! You almost gave me a heart attack. And not to sound accusatory, not that I don't have one coming soon anyway. She stared intently at the youth. He looked around 8 or 9, undernourished and dirty, so that his skin seemed an earthy brown. The hair was matted, yet traces of yellow gold popped here and there under the filth. He was naked, and obviously male, though he wore much jewelry. Nothing flashy or expensive, most of it looked homemade. The child lifted his head and Mayu sighed. The eyes were such a pretty blue, but filled with such despair. Obviously someone had decided to abandon the poor thing. Why was it that there were people who had children and didn't want them, while there were people who desperately wanted them but couldn't have any? It was so unfair, and it seemed someone had dumped a little angel out in the forest, to starve and die. Hey there, little one, she said gently and slowly walked to the child's side, careful not to spook him. Are you hungry? I've got little on me, but if you come home with me, I can make you a nice meal. Despite the apparent despair, the boy's eyes seemed sharp and watchful, and they followed her movements. There was an air of steadiness that seemed unnatural in a child his age, but he made no movements or sign that he understood her words. Kneeling down next to him, she reached out slowly and placed her hand on his forehead in a soothing motion. Something flashed in his eyes, perhaps an echo of rage, but the boy's shoulders sagged and his head fell dejectedly to his chest. Her heart went out to him. Over the days he had taken to wandering about aimlessly, nowhere to go and not really caring. He had never been alone like this, and he found it maddening, the silence, the isolation. Though the forest was teeming with life, most of the animals fled when he approached. His appetite was non-existent, he had no energy to hunt for food, and had little control to lure anything in. He came across no other demons in the wilderness, and stopped wondering when he would. He had never seen any other when he was with the pack. The pack had been his world. There was him, there was them, there were the animals and the humans, and that was it. Now there was just him. Resting was welcome, for he found that he thought less when pulled into the stupor, and had discovered that resting was lasting longer than it used to. He could only connect it with the fact that he hadn't been eating much, he'd used up much of his reserves, and his body was weakening. Would he fall into a permanent resting when his body became too weak? Or would he fall into that oblivion, that puzzling darkness that he had experienced many days ago? There was a hissing near his foot, and Sunny glanced down listlessly at the green snake that reared its small body at him. Right now he hated snakes. Snakes were nothing but trouble, and that particular snake had ruined everything. Occasionally the flash of the newly acquired necklace would remind him of him. Sunny's hand flashed down and grabbed the snake around its middle. The small serpent writhed and sank its small fangs into his arm. Feeling agitated, Sunny grabbed its head with his free arm and yanked it from his arm, scowling as its fangs tore at his dirty flesh. In retaliation, or perhaps to revive a diminishing appetite, Sunny took a solid bite out of the snake and chewed experimentally. It tasted of dead leaves. With a sigh, Sunny tossed the snake far from him and slumped to the ground. Before, he had never understood what tired was, how it felt, and why it was that most creatures besides he felt it. But now, tired was all he felt. The sound of feet met his tired ears, the scent of human soon after, and Sunny was aware that there was a human within the vicinity. How far had he wandered? He searched for the traces of the source, wary that this could be one of them, but there was none. It was an ordinary, pathetic, human. It would be so easy to kill, if he could muster the energy. Then the human was in the area, and the sound of their language assaulted his sensitive ears. He was startled at the relief he felt, but understood. He'd been so lonely, that even though he was likely to kill the human, he was grateful for its presence. He lifted his head and stared at the human. It was one of the decaying ones, the dying ones. Crick had said that humans were fragile creatures, and that there were 1,000,001 ways to kill them. They healed slowly, caught multiple ailments many times a year, and after a while, their bodies began to rot around them until they died. The decaying ones tasted dull and gamey, too much flesh and very little meat. Their bones were always brittle and the succulent marrow lacked the vibrant taste he always enjoyed. But the worst thing was that their hearts were useless to dine on, his favorite part of the human body. As the decaying human, female, slowly made it to his side, cooing all the while, Sunny felt another wave of despair. He wasn't hungry, and this filthy human wasn't going to do anything for his appetite. Its wrinkled hand reached out and touched his forehead. His world shattered. He was so lonely. He missed the pack, missed the world that he knew and loved. And its touch was so welcome. Keitaro sat grimly in Umbu HQ, finishing his report, and worrying over Muragi's wound, that constantly burned. He had yet to leave the hospital, and it seemed that the blackness left behind from the bite was spreading. Then there was the previous mission, which had disturbed him. Upon returning to dig up Yoshiru's body, not only was the mound of dirt dug up, but Yoshiru's corpse was nowhere in sight. Along with the missing cadaver, only 3 demons remained. The one burnt to a crisp, the one with the severed head, and the mostly crushed one, whose head had escaped being squashed. The other was gone, the one that had been injured from the get-go. How had it survived? And most importantly, where was it now? Was it seeking out the Jinchuriki? Chapter 8, Child of the Forest. Coaxing the child to follow her was a challenge since the boy seemed to have lost interest in her, not that he seemed interested in the first place. She also had the suspicion that her words fell on deaf ears, for there was little comprehension in those pretty eyes. Mayu took a dirty hand in her own and got to her feet, groaning at her protesting back. She tried to pull the boy to his feet, but he remained slumped on the forest floor. "Oh, come now, sweetie. Let's get you to my home and get you cleaned up." The child glanced up at her and then pushed his feet under him and rising shakily to his feet. Mayu swallowed. He must be weak with hunger. She gripped his hand tightly, which remained limp in her grasp, and began to do what came naturally to her. Talk. She had no idea why she had become a hermit. "Don't you worry," she said conversationally. "I've got lots of food back home. I can make pancakes and muffins okay, so they're pre-packaged, but they're delicious. I live in the forest, but the nearest village is not so far from here." She glanced down at the boy's face. Even with the cover of dirt, she could see that he was beautiful, with such fine and perfectly symmetrical features that it almost seemed unnatural. When she finally realized that talking wasn't necessary, she calmly trekked back to the cottage. Every now and then she would glance down at the youth and take in things that she found fascinating about him. One was the way he walked, like he not only was a part of the forest, but owned it as well. While she crunched over fallen leaves and sticks, each step he took seemed perfectly placed. He all but glided as he walked, not a sound came from his footsteps. Another was his steady quiet eye that seemed completely focused on the path ahead, and yet, he seemed completely aware of his surroundings. This was proven true when a small fat rabbit dashed across their path, completely startling her yet leaving the boy completely unperturbed. Only his eyes showed a quick and passing interest before they drifted back to the fore. This child was in need of some serious rehabilitation. "We're here," she murmured happily as they came upon the cottage. The sun had set in the horizon, which was hidden by the many trees that made up the forest. Immediately the boy stopped, eyes focused sharply on the cottage. When she and her husband had come across the place in the beginning, it was a nightmare. It had started out as a small fur trapping business. At some point in time, the place was abandoned, and many of its victims remained. However, months of cleansing, planting, and rebuilding had turned the death trap into a lovely 2-bed 1-bath haven. She had spent every summer here, and when her husband had passed away, somehow summers became falls, and soon after winters and springs. She had managed to isolate herself from the world, only going into town when supplies ran low. She gently tugged on his arm, and was startled at how stiff and unyielding it had become, like a limb of lead. Looking upon the boy, she marveled at how still he had become, and the only thing that moved were his nostrils. Could he smell the death that had once taken place here? Was that even possible? "Don't worry, sweetie," she reassured while patting his stiff hand. "No one has died here, not for a long time anyway. You're completely safe here. I promise." The boy glanced up at her with what looked like an annoyed look before taking a step forward. Mayu beamed and began to walk slowly toward her home, eyeing her flowers and roses to make sure they didn't need watering for the next day. As she stepped onto her spacious porch, she couldn't help but sigh with relief at being home. She couldn't imagine leaving this place for good, but she knew that when the time came, she didn't want to be all alone. The boy pulled his hand out of her grip and slowly stepped up onto the porch, blue eyes darting here and there, taking in the screen door and the windows. A strange clicking sound began to rise from his throat, but he seemed unaware of it as he slowly touched her rocking chair with a grubby finger and watched as it gently rocked. She stood back and watched him as he peered about her porch, before his eyes fell on her again. She swallowed. There was a look in his eyes, a look so foreign that she was unsure of what it was. They were so steady, and calm, and slightly calculating. It made the hairs on her arms rise. "What are you thinking?" she whispered, and felt a wave of relief as the look faded and the child began to gaze off somewhere. Rubbing her hands together, she decided to address the first thing on the agenda. "A bath. Now I'm sure you're used to being dirty, but we need to get you cleaned up," she said and began to head into the house. The boy's eyes followed the swinging of the screen door before he nimbly approached and poked his head through the doorway, nostrils flaring and eyes darting here and there. "Come on," she gestured, and headed for the hallway, grinning as he took a careful step into the house, before quickly following her. Mayu turned on the bathroom light and turned to see him peering into her bedroom. His head swiveled toward her when she turned on the light and his beautiful blue eyes narrowed. Mayu smiled and gestured for the boy to enter. The blonde peered into the bathroom, sniffed, and she watched as his upper lip curled in disdain. Mayu peered around her spotless bathroom. Did it smell? The youth stepped in and eyed the toilet, then stared at her with disgust. Mayu blushed, pulled open the sliding door, and turned on the faucet for the tub. The boy took a fascinated step forward, clicking all the while, and stared in wonderment at the flowing faucet. "This, my dear, is a bathtub." She poured some bath soap into the accumulating water. "This is something I hope you'll enjoy." The boy stood quietly, eyes narrowed yet curious. Mayu reached out and touched his wrist. "Let's take off all your jewelry first, okay? So they don't get water damage." She fumbled to unhook one of the many bracelets. The blonde eyed his wrist, then the water. His free hand flashed through his bracelets and they tumbled to the linoleum floor. In a matter of moments, bracelets, anklets, necklaces, and earrings became a pile on the floor, and he promptly stepped into the tub. A look of surprise passed over his face at the warm water, then he sat down with a splash into the tub and began to rub at his arms. Mayu grabbed the shampoo, poured it into his filthy blonde hair, and began to massage it into his hair. The boy paused in his rubbing, glanced at her, then continued to scrub on. The first week living with the blonde was actually the most interesting thing she had ever done. The first interesting thing was getting the child to bed. After he had rummaged through her house for a few hours, she had ushered him to the spare room. After the bath he had taken, he turned out to be the most beautiful boy she had ever seen. His hair all but glowed, along with his skin, that had turned out to be such a gentle tan under all that dirt. Was it even possible to look so perfect? Pulling back the covers on the spare bed, she nudged him to lie down. He kept fixing her with puzzled and annoyed looks, as if he couldn't understand the concept of sleeping in a bed. She placed the pillow under his head and sighed. Earlier she had tried to get him to eat something, a start in curing his slightly emaciated body, but the boy had made a face at her sandwiches and had ignored her in favor of exploring. She stared down at the child, wondering what his name was, yet too tired to go through the steps of finding out. The day had tired her out, and she couldn't wait to shower and sleep. She glanced at the boy and saw that his eyes remained open and watchful, his body motionless under the covers. His sapphire eyes remained on her, that calculating look again. "What are you thinking?" she murmured, but he continued to watch her. Mayu yawned and leaned back into the chair she had moved to the side of his bed. His bed. Already the room was his, as if it had been waiting for the child. Mayu closed her eyes and relaxed. Life was going to be more interesting from now on. Mayu jerked awake, her back stiff and a kink in her neck. She groaned and sat up in the chair, rubbing her sore neck and moaning. Her eyes fell on the bed and froze. The covers were rumpled, but there was no child in them. Mayu jumped up and hissed as her back cracked. She shuffled out of the room and checked the bathroom. The bathtub was full of soapy water and the brown towel lay in a pile on the floor. He obviously was used to bathing regularly. A relief. Quickly pulling the plug to drain the water, she rushed into the living room and saw that it was empty. The kitchen gave the same results. Mayu's heart pounded. She turned and headed for the door, but paused when she noticed it was open. The blonde child was crouching on the porch, dressed in a white shirt she had given to him last night. The sun shone off his body, making him seem to glow. Mayu sighed at the ethereal picture the motionless child seemed to create and opened the screen door. The child did not give any indication that he had heard her, and as she approached, he remained in that painful crouch on the balls of his feet, elbows on his knees, face cradled in his delicate hands. His eyes were unreadable. What was he thinking about? Hey there. Are you hungry? The boy glanced at her, but seemed to lose interest immediately. Mayu stepped in front of him and poked a finger to her chest. Mayu. Mayu, she pointed to him, ignoring the annoyed expression. She pointed to herself again. Mayu. She pointed to him again. The boy glanced over her shoulder into the sun. Mayu turned, squinted into the light, then turned back to the youth. He opened his mouth, and a sound, or was it a word, slurred out of his mouth. It sounded so sinister and so unnatural, even impossible, that it sent shivers down her spine. His nostrils flared and he lifted his head slightly, something shifting in his eyes as he stared at her. This was the second time she had seen that look, and she now understood. It was the look of a predator. What? She stuttered nervously, eyes trapped. The look was still there, watching her. It was the calculating look times 10. Then the boy removed his hand from cradling his face and pointed over her shoulder. Mayu hesitated to turn her back. But she did, yet the sun was in her way. Mayu turned back, however the child was still pointing. Mayu turned back, then understood. Son? She asked incredulously, and pointed at it. Son? Or, Sunny? The boy replaced his hand back in its spot and gazed silently at her. So your name is Sunny? What an appropriate name. Mayu, she pointed to herself, then pointed at him. Sunny. Mayu. Sunny. The gaze became more intense. The child began to grasp what she was implying. Sunny, he said suddenly, and she winced when something was mixed with it. She didn't know how it was possible, but when he said his name, he also made another sound, something dark and heavy, completely contradictory to his actual wording, and impossible to say without a second head, or mouth, or something. Sune, she corrected. The boy swallowed, as if to clear his throat, and a look of concentration lined his thin brow. Suani, he breathed. It was better, but with a whispering hiss. Mayu beamed. All right then, Sunny. I'm going to teach you all I can. And when you are ready, we can head back to civilization, where we belong. She lifted her head as a pleasant breeze ruffled her gray hair. Sunny too lifted his head from his hands and gazed off at the rustling leaves that sang high in the treetops. Finally, she wasn't alone anymore. Sunny was turning out to be the most extraordinary thing. There was so much about him that was different from the regular child that she decided to document them in order to keep her mind from overloading. Sunny lacked characteristics that would peg him as a child, and yet, on some occasions, she was reminded that he was. As was already evident, Sunny seemed to love jewelry. In the beginning, she had cleaned and sanded down all his wooden trinkets. One was actually the skull of a small bat, and had thought he would be touchy about her handling his possessions. But when he noticed she was cleaning them, he actually seemed pleased, and this had made her very happy. Though he did not smile, his features seemed to soften, and had sat at the table and waited patiently for her to finish. She had even made a beaded red necklace for him that he had quickly added to the others. Teaching him Japanese was hard. She was not a teacher, but Sunny was a quick learner with good memory. He never forgot the words and their meanings, but had a hard time with pronunciation. Most of his words sounded warped and cryptic, but once she had gotten past the eerie sounds, she could understand his half-sentences. Sunny's favorite words, however, was, "Good afternoon." He said it every morning at the wrong time of day with a strange luring quality that gave her chills. It was the only two words he could say without the demonic noises behind them. It was also the only time he smiled, but it was really a leer, showing off cruel sharp teeth. His teeth. Another thing to back up the calculating looks. His teeth were small, like the young child he was, but they were all sharp. When teaching him to brush his teeth, something that curiously seemed to excite him, something about the peppermint taste, she found that he had very few chewing teeth. Only the very back were for chewing, and even they were kind of sharp. He had a predator's mouth, one for tearing and rending. That theory was made more solid by the fact that he never ate the food she provided, and yet, he seemed to gain more healthy weight so his ribs did not show so much. He must be hunting at night while she was sleeping. Sleeping. There was another thing that seemed disturbing. Sunny did not sleep. At first she figured he only slept for a few hours in the wee hours in the morning, but upon challenging herself to prove this theory, she managed to keep Sunny inside by introducing him to her radio, and had stayed up watching him listen to the music. He had sat by the radio all night, blue eyes vacant, face distant. At first she had thought he slept with his eyes open, but occasionally they would shift, or he would blink. She didn't think it was possible for someone to become so inanimate, especially a young boy. Every once in a while he would lay or slump around for a few hours, eyes heavy-lidded, and for once, he would seem tired. When she would try to goad him into doing something, he would only give her a look of sluggish annoyance. But the thing that really blew her mind was the fact that Sunny only used the bathroom for bathing and brushing his teeth. He never used the toilet. At first she figured he wasn't potty trained and didn't know how to use it, but when she began to go through the steps of showing him how, he had given her the nastiest look she had ever seen. Like she was some dirty whore. She'd left it alone until they could communicate better, and when she asked him why he didn't use the toilet, he had given a clipped reply that he did not create waste like some animal. Was that possible? Was Sunny human? If not, what was he? Sometimes, she was sure he was human, especially when it rained. She'd been aware for some time that there was something that was making him depressed, some tragedy that caused occasional looks of despair to cloud his eyes. Sunny always cried, always wept on those days, when it thundered and rained. It was the only time he showed violence toward himself, beating his head with his fists, biting his hands with his sharp teeth. Her consolation was little help. It was obvious that he was not used to being held. He had once pushed her away, and the sheer force and power in that one action had left her wary for days. She always looked for the self-inflicted wounds that she was sure would be there, but his hands were always smooth. There were times when it was all worth it, of course. She wasn't lonely any longer, something that had plagued her after her husband had died. And she was always happy when Sunny talked to her. He did not speak often. Sunny was often in his own world, but when he did, it was always rewarding. She had once been beating feathers into his hair when she asked him why he kept trying to chew the toothpaste. She had not expected a reply, and was startled when she received one. Peppermint. What? She asked, peering at his face in surprise. I chew peppermint. Mayu laughed and kissed his forehead. What that? Mayu smiled, her eyes softening. Well, it's called a kiss. It's to show affection, or to show you like someone. Sunny sent her a thoughtful look before moving off. Days later she had gathered enough peppermint to last a week and then produced them to a very surprised youth. Sunny now constantly chewed peppermint, smelling minty at all times. Having Sunny in her life made it worth living, watching him, worrying over where he was, or what he was eating. She knew he was becoming comfortable with the life she had provided for him, and worried what would happen when it was all gone. She knew her time was short. Chapter 9, Reminder of Rage. The first time Sunny asked about Shinobi was the day they came crashing through their haven. Mayu had been in the garden, rummaging around in the plants while Sunny sat in the living room, perched on the windowsill and gazing at nothing. She couldn't fathom how he did that or why he was so inactive. Most boys his age spent half their time bouncing off walls. And yet, when he was in her presence, he did nothing but sit, though she was sure he was more active when he wasn't near her. It had been a full year since the boy had joined her, a year to become acquainted with one another, to become utterly attached. Mayu wiped her brow and stretched her aching back. It seemed as if more pain was felt these days, her breath always seemed short. She glanced at Sunny, smiling wearily as she watched him chew methodically on his cultivated peppermint. He seemed so sweet, with such beautiful features, but she remembered the first time she had seen him eat. He had been approaching the house after spending the night out in the forest. She had chafed her hands in worry, wondering where he was, or if he was coming back. That gave her the most worry, because it was obvious that Sunny was not as dependent on her as she was on him. But that morning, Sunny appeared into the clearing with a spring in his step she had never seen before. She had risen from the rocking chair, all set to give him a hug, when she noticed his lips were smeared crimson, a flash of red in his eyes. She froze at the red lump in his bloodied hand. He had grinned at her, sharp teeth coated in blood, and took a steady bite of the mysterious lump. She had swallowed and tried not to throw up, but she was an old woman and very little of her body functions did what she wanted. Mayu had vomited, Sunny had looked disgusted, a facial expression she saw often, and had wandered off. She knew that Sunny was consuming some kind of food, and she suspected it to be meat, and yet somehow she foolishly imagined he would cook it over a fire. She felt embarrassed now, for making the assumption, especially since all signs pointed to how feral Sunny actually was. But Sunny had returned later, and she had given him a pair of earrings to appease him. Mayu blushed, and as she bent to tend to the barley, she completely missed the intense look that passed over the passive face, and how the blue eyes bled to red. There was a rustling in the trees, and something shiny flew from one side of the clearing to the other, lodging itself into one of the trees with a solid thunk that shook the leaves. Mayu straightened, eyes going wide in recognition of the weapon. Moments later a human blur followed the weapon, disappeared into the leaves, and was quickly followed by two others, causing Mayu to drop her basket and head quickly for the porch. She had seen very few shinobi in her lifetime. No one in her family had ever taken up the profession, but she had always been wary of people who were trained to kill as children. Mayu passed through the screen door and gazed in nervous silence, waiting to see if any more shinobi were going to pass through. She hoped they didn't decide to fight in the clearing where her house was in danger of damage. A hissing and reverberating groan that rumbled her very bones turned her towards Sunny, and her mouth went dry. Sunny's vacant expression was now replaced with a rage she had never seen on his face before. His once beautiful blue eyes were bloodshot, such a violent crimson, his teeth were bared, seeming sharper and more sinister. His fingers clenched and unclenched as he glared in fury at the clearing. "Sunny?" she whispered, and that searing gaze fell on her, causing Mayu to back up and swallow harshly. The hate that burned clearly in his eyes was now focused on her. A hiss of air passed through his teeth as he took a fluid step toward her. His teeth parted and a screech split the crackling air. Mayu gasped and shut her eyes as Sunny leapt toward her. There was a gust of wind, a whiff of peppermint, and the bang of the screen door. Mayu's eyes opened as she saw the last of Sunny's feet vanish at the top of the door. Mayu spun towards the window and saw a golden blur leap into the trees. The clearing adopted the silence of a graveyard. Mayu wiped the sweat from her brow with a shaky hand and slumped into a nearby chair. She had never seen Sunny so angry before, never seen him give her such a look, like if she had made one wrong move he would have torn her heart out. Mayu moaned. She really couldn't take any more of this excitement. "I hope Sunny comes back." He was mad, very mad. Seeing those filthy humans come charging through his dwelling, his territory, Sunny kicked a tree viciously and then dodged out of the way as it toppled to the ground, remembering his last encounter with falling trees. He dug his fingers into the healthy bark and screamed his fury to the forest, his cries causing the birds to burst in flight. Sunny's head snapped up, his eyes darting at the birds as they escaped the trees, the thump of their wings beating reaching his ears. He watched as the last bird disappeared from view before he slumped down on the fallen tree, and dug into his pouch for peppermint. The scent of foreign humans still hung in his nostrils. He could taste the acrid fear of the first human that was being chased by the others. He could still feel their bloodlust as they had chased the other. Sunny rocked and chewed, red eyes vacant with thought, ears twitching at the sounds of the crickets in the distance. The sounds of animals always tended to be in the distance, because they always evacuated the area when he came around. Perhaps the human woman Mayu had not noticed the absence of animals near her dwelling. They had come even with the smell of death permeating the area, but upon his arrival they had all fled. Only a few of the stubborn animals would remain, and they were always the first to be eaten. Sunny's mind returned to the humans with the source, and he flinched. What made him so angry was that he had felt fear before the initial rage at their approach. For a few moments, he had believed that it was the ones that had killed his pack, coming to search for him and kill him with their superior use of the source. But they had not smelled of them, for he had their scent, the taste of one's blood, packed away in his mind. Sunny knew he was superior to the human race. It was obvious in every way, shape, and form. It was so obvious, that his defeat was an embarrassment to all that is demon. Surely others of his kind would be ashamed of him, disgusted at his poor performance. Sunny growled and scratched his head roughly in frustration. It was obvious that revenge was in order, slow, painful, drawn-out revenge, with as much screaming as possible. Sunny's eyes began to glow, the irises expanding so that the whites were drowned out. His ears began to elongate, turning red and black at the tips as he began to salivate and drool at the mouth, teeth growing longer, sharper. His breath was short but deep, his fingernails growing longer. His eyes were focused on a distant corner, but his mind was full of blood, the succulent screams of human pain, their cries for mercy. He was going to eat them alive, and make them watch every moment of it. The rage left, though, along with its physical effects as reality returned to him. It was undeniable, that the humans could use the source in ways he could not imagine, and they would make a fool of him until he knew how it was done. But how to learn? Sunny began to rock again, pondering at the problem. It was many hours later, and blush of embarrassment, when the solution came to him. Sunny jumped to his feet and hopped back to the dwelling. Upon entering the clearing, Sunny pulled the sharp weapon from the tree and headed for the cottage. Inside he could feel Mayu's anxious heart flutter, she was so easy to rattle. Opening the screen door, Sunny approached the old human female and leered, enjoying the look and scent of terror wafting off of her. Then he mentally smacked himself. Be nice to the human, Sunny. She's done you much good. The human pulled herself to her feet and slowly approached him, a weak smile gracing her wrinkled features. Sunny! You're back. I was so worried, and you were so upset. Her eyes kept traveling to his eyes, then at the sharp weapon in his grip. He then remembered that he hadn't changed his eyes to blue again, and that they had remained at his natural color. He did not care to change it back, he figured she could handle the change. Sunny lifted the weapon so that she could see it more clearly. What dis? His Japanese, as she called it, apparently humans had different ways of speaking depending on the region, was pitiful. He found that only when he thought out each word first, that he actually sounded similar to her. But long pauses during a conversation were awkward, and Mayu often thought that he had lost interest in speaking to her, which was only half true. The human tongue was easy to remember, but hard to pronunciate, and he found that he preferred not to speak it at all. But it was now necessary, and he was pleased that he had taken the time to learn it. Mayu eyed the weapon nervously before seeming to relax, the fear leaving her scent. I think it's called a kunai. I'm not positively sure, I don't know much about ninja. Sunny's eyes narrowed as he computed her words and their meanings. He clicked in thought and began to gather some words to produce a proper sentence. What is a ninja? Mayu sat down in her seat again and rubbed her forehead, her brow crinkling in thought. Well, from what I know, ninja, or shinobi, are warriors. They live in hidden villages and go on missions of all types, she frowned, obviously racking her brain for information. And protect their villages. Her eyes fell on him again, and she shrugged. I really don't know much about them. No one in my family ever entered that career. Sunny had his head bowed so his chin was touching his bare chest, ears pricked and listening to her words while his mind feverishly worked in translating them. If none of her kin entered the career, it must mean that if they wanted to, they could have. That must mean that anyone could be this ninja, and that what he needed was to find these hidden villages. He took a deep breath and waited for the words to form in his head, the things he needed to say in the human tongue that he wanted her to understand completely. He wasn't keen on giving her any more information about himself, and yet, even though she was nothing more than a pitiful human, she had given much to him without asking for anything in return. He could respect that, despite her species. These ninja, have killed my kin, my pack. I must, she watched as his eyes darted here and there, searching for words that he needed her to hear. I must avenge what was mine. Must find these ninja. He looked up to her brown eyes clouded with tears, and resisted the urge to roll his eyes and gloat at the same time. These were overtaken by the urge to scowl when she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him, muttering pointless reassurances in his ear, something that made him want to howl. She had no idea how well he could hear. When she finally let him go, and got her emotions under control, a sadness came into her eyes. All right, love. Tomorrow we'll head to the village and find out what we can about a hidden village, and maybe we can get you enrolled into an academy, okay? Sunny nodded and jumped to his feet, heading toward the small hard box Mayu called a radio, and turned it on. He liked music, one of the only things he admired about humans, besides the way they tasted. Any and all demons of refined tastes would agree that human was the best tasting meat, and if one disagreed, it was simply because they had never tasted one before. The human blood was richer, full of zest and life, and the meat was just between strong and soft. Offspring were the sweetest, adult males were the spiciest, and the females were stuck right in the middle. Females were the hardest to lure, especially when they were with offspring, for they tended to be more wary, protective, and often enough, downright psychotic when it came to protecting their young. Younglings and adult males were the easiest, because for some reason, they tended to be most curious, and adult males seemed so sure of their existence, that danger was often the last thing on their puny brains. Sunny began to rock back and forth. All these thoughts about human flesh was making him yearn for the taste of their blood on his lips. His eyes darted to the human female occupying the room. She was wiping down surfaces, still looking as if someone had died. Sunny grimaced. If he had eaten her, she would unlikely settle nastily inside him, and then there would be the guilt, and no doubt, she would taste bad to begin with. Sunny shut his eyes and enjoyed the sound of the music, and vaguely realized that resting was coming in a few hours. He must have been so agitated that he hadn't noticed. He wondered how many centuries he would have to live before he could throw off resting like Crick and Ka could. A lump appeared in his throat and he immediately surged to his feet, ignoring Mayu's inquiries, and left the dwelling. He'd rest in the forest like he used to. And tomorrow, the road to revenge would begin. He was aware of her distress, but he couldn't move from his bedding in the canopy. He could hear her muffled cries and the sound of her old heart pounding like a rabbit, quick, flighty. But he could not move. Resting wasn't finished yet, and his mind wasn't allowing him to feel the urge to come to her rescue. Sunny lay in the tree, mind sluggish and weak, his most vulnerable time. But he could sniff, and he took deep breaths through his nose, trying to catch the scent of blood in the air. Perhaps she had fallen. Apparently Mayu was afraid of that, brittle bones, she had said. If that was so, she would have to wait for him, though he couldn't imagine what he would do if that were the case. He was no healer. He'd eaten a healer once. Spade had told him of a time when he was changing, and they hadn't known that was happening. They had gotten a human female to look after him until he was well, and then she had accidentally fallen and killed herself. He had laughed at the time. It was an amusing story, but now it didn't seem that funny. Humans die when they fall. But why should he care about some stupid human? Sunny's body twitched. But then, Mayu wasn't just any human. She was his human. She was part of his new pack, and she was in pain. Sunny's head lifted from the leaves. A sound reached his ears, completely slurred, but sounding eerily like his name. Mayu was calling him, and she didn't sound too good. The source surged through his body, and to his own shock, he jumped to his feet. Sunny stood there for a moment, complete disbelief shrouding him, for he had shook off resting, but tossed it aside for later examination as he leaped from the tree to the next, heading for the dwelling. With a rather powerful jump, using some of the source to propel him farther, he cleared the clearing and landed with barely a sound on the porch, then charged into the room, senses on full alert as his red eyes took in the scene. Mayu was in her nightgown, sprawled on the kitchen floor, face down, legs splayed. Sunny sniffed the air for intruders, but could smell none. His ears twitched as he rushed to the human female's side and turned her over, scanning her body for wounds. But he could see none. Then he looked at her face and jerked his head back in shock. The right side of Mayu's face seemed slightly twisted, yet slack, while the other was clearly etched in misery, her brown eyes swollen with despair, tears streaking down her face. Would happen? Sunny asked incredulously, staring in a horrified fascination as the left side of her mouth began to move while the right remained slackened and dead. A gurgle passed her lips, but the only thing he could understand at the moment was his name. Sunny growled and stood to his feet, grabbing her arm and pulling her up, perhaps in a hope that she would gain her bearings and return to her feet. But her body lay slack and she gave a small cry of pain as he wrenched her arm. Sunny dropped her back on the floor in frustration and stamped his foot in anger. "What's matter, why you?" He hissed angrily, and knew that most of his human speech was deteriorating and he was returning to his native tongue. This seemed to distress Mayu more and she began to weep openly, small animal-like sounds coming from her mouth. Sunny kicked a chair violently, and watched as it soared across the room and shattered against the far wall, her wails increasing in volume at his display of violence. He clawed angrily at the couch, tearing into the fabric with ease. "Shut up!" Sunny screamed, aware that he had abandoned the human tongue altogether. The sound of his natural voice was now pulling her into hysterics. "Stop crying! What's the matter with you? Get up!" Sunny viscously grabbed her arm and yanked it, causing a scream of pain to erupt through her throat. Sunny dropped the arm and ran from the cottage to the other side of the clearing, where her cries did not hurt his ears so much. He sat down under a tree and covered his ears, waiting for her to shut up. He grit his teeth. If this were any other human, he would have torn out its throat long ago. But he couldn't, because this was Mayu, and he was fond of her. There. He had admitted it. He was fond of a human. Oh, the others must be turning in their graves. Or he hoped they had graves. An hour later, he cautiously removed his hands from his ears, and was relieved to hear that the woman had stopped crying. But she was now calling out to him, sounding so pathetic, like a newborn calling for its mother. Sunny slowly got to his feet and walked up to the porch, and entered the house. He could almost feel her relief when she heard the bang of the screen door. Sunny entered the living room and saw that she was exactly where he had left her, and that she had soiled herself, judging by the stench. Sunny kept the grimace of disgust from his face as he moved to her side. Her face was swollen from crying, but the right side was still slack, the skin seeming stuck, and the eyelid hanging over the eye. Her good eye focused on him and it brimmed with tears, and for a moment he thought she was going to start crying all over again, but instead she managed a half-smile with the remaining side of her face. The arm that he had yanked lifted and settled in his hair. "Sorry, Sunny. Can't take you to the village." Her words were slurred and wet, and it seemed hard for her to form a sentence. Sunny ground his teeth together. "What the matter, why you?" Then he controlled his speech. "Why won't you get up?" A tear escaped her eye, but she still smiled. "Smile or me, Sunny." "Just once." Sunny blinked and sat back on his heels as her hand dropped from his hair and to the floor. He knew a last request when he heard one, and his heart sank. She was leaving him, just like the pack had. Was this his fault too? Had he done something to bring this strange ailment upon her? She had been sad when he had mentioned the ninja, but Sunny looked into her face. Well, if she wanted a smile, hell, he'd give her one and more. Changing his eyes to the bluest color he could imagine, he beamed softly at her, imaging that she was Spate or Tka. He opened his mouth and began to sing the lure, something she had never heard, but made it the softest he could. He stroked her gray hair as her eye widened, focused on his face, her hand lifted again and she stroked his cheek. Like an angel, she whispered, and Sunny placed both hands on the sides of her face, smiling and singing as he quickly twisted her head, breaking her neck with a quick, painless snap. He watched as the light faded from her eye, as her body became still. He held her head as he allowed his words to fade, having wanted his singing to be the last thing she heard. He then rocked back on his heels and wondered. Now what? Which way to a hidden village? Did he know? Who did he ask? Sunny scratched his head and looked away from the body. Mustn't look at it. Mustn't acknowledge what it had been. He wrapped his arms around his knees and rocked back and forth. Mayu must have known who to ask, what questions to ask. She had said they would go to the village and ask about a hidden village, but which way was the village, what human would he ask? Mayu had known. Mayu had gone to a village to pick up supplies for herself, or more of the bath soap that he had liked, but he had never gone with her. Sunny's eyes turned to the body. Actually, Mayu would still know. Sunny reached out and touched her head. It was still kind of warm, the brain and its information still useful. Sunny did not like to eat brains. Brains were mushy, no matter what type of animal it came from, and it was messy, and gleaning information from most brains was pointless. It had never occurred to him to eat the brains of humans, because at the time there was no need to know what they knew. But now he needed some information, and Mayu had it, or a little of it. Reaching out, he deftly cracked her skull open and scooped out the brain matter, quickly downing the matter before the taste made him ill. Immediately upon swallowing, images flashed through his mind. A small human playing with another. Flash. A human woman looking similar to Mayu holding hands with a human male. Hisoka. Flash. Then there was a Mayu bent over a mound of dirt, sobbing miserably. Flash. There was the dwelling as he knew it, and a sense of loneliness. Flash. And then there was him, and he was staring at himself, or more like her, with an annoyed expression on his face, but something swelled within him, something happy and content. Sunny screeched and stuck his fingers down his throat, forcing the brain matter to leave his system, throwing it up on the wooden floor. He backed away from the body and groaned. He knew that emotion she had felt, understood it, and it distressed him, because he knew that he did not deserve it. Sunny left the dwelling and stood at the bottom of the porch, gazing at the house. He had not been a good demon, as a matter of fact, he had done poorly, but he would make it up. He would avenge the pack, and he had at least given Mayu something to smile about. She had seen him as some kind of savior, from what he did not know, because he could not save anything. Sunny gurgled as he forced bile from his stomach and vomited onto the wooden porch, and it immediately caught flame. He watched as the flame burned, then slowly begin to spread along the porch. He couldn't bear the thought of some human coming along and inhabiting the place, her place, his place. An hour later, the cabin burned, his red eyes glowed. He had things to do now, a purpose, a reason for being. And they would pay. He would find a hidden village, and all ninja with the source will burn. And he would enjoy it, learning their secrets, fooling them into feeling safe. And he would be much more careful this time with his emotions. He didn't need another Mayu to come along. No, not again. He then turned his back on the inferno, the light seeming to make him glow like a golden apparition, and gave a wan smile. Goodbye, Mayu. Chapter 10, Return to Fire Country. The discrepancies made him nervous, as he hovered near the outskirts of the forest, hidden by the remaining copse of trees. In the distance he could hear the faint buzz of humans, and though his eyesight was exemplary, he could not see them. All he could see was the yellow and green grass that lay like an ocean, touching the horizon. From left to right, there was nothing but a sea of grass, and Sunny felt anxiety come rushing to the fore. No trees, no large jutting rocks, just grass and the sky. No place to hide, an easy target for any and all. Sunny had never lived under the sky, the pack had reared him amongst the great trees, coddled in their loving branches, and Sunny shrank back into their embrace. With no trees, the world seemed larger, infinite. He shut his eyes against the blaring sun. He felt like such a coward, afraid to step out into the open. What would the others say? With that thought, Sunny squared his shoulders, lifted his chin, and leaped out into the grass that brushed softly at his knees. His eyes darted, taking in all directions at once, waiting for some type of attack, but only the distant cry of a bird assaulted his ears. Sunny blushed and allowed some of the tension to flow out of him. Who was he kidding? No human or other demon could sneak up on him, and resting was a solid week away. He could bury himself when the time came. Sunny began to walk purposefully toward the distant sounds of human. The feeling of the wind blowing through his hair brought Sunny's face skyward, and he gazed silently at the white puffy clouds that drifted lazily across the cerulean sky. It was startlingly peaceful out here. The only sounds accompanying him was the crunch and rustle of his movements and the occasional bird call. He could either get to like it very much or hate it pretty quickly, which he didn't know. Sunny walked on at a measured and rather leisurely pace, snared a passing hare as a quick meal, and continued on until the village came within his sight, and he faced another dilemma. He had never been among other humans unless he was eating them, wasn't aware of the social norms of human society, or the smell they created when they congregated together in one place. Sunny groaned and covered his nose. The variety of smells had assaulted his senses, causing his eyes to water and his nose to prickle. Filthy creatures, he hissed in his native tongue and glared at the mud and wooden dwellings. He could hear the hustle and bustle of everyday human life, and regretted not taking Mayu's offers to join her on her monthly trips down here. At least he would know what to expect. Sunny dropped down on his bottom and contemplated his next move. Go through the village or around it, perhaps missing his chance to learn of a hidden village. Sunny jumped to his feet again and stalked toward the village. He had to stop thinking too deeply or second-guessing his decisions. It was annoyance and a waste of his time. 10 minutes later, he found himself standing at a corner, watching humans move around their puzzling and pointless lives. It was strange, their business, how they moved with such purpose, many faces intent upon some obscure destination. They were always moving, even when they were standing in one place. Mouths jabbered, hands waved, and faces twisted between one moment and the next. He watched as one human female shouted angrily at a male, arms waving and occasionally whacking him on the shoulders. He would wince and cower under her fury, though he was larger and most definitely stronger. Sunny cocked his ear toward her, in an attempt to pick up her words, but they were too quick for him to process, and he gave up with a sidelong glance at the scene. He then rocked on his feet, wondering who he should ask about ninja. As a man passed, Sunny reached out and grabbed his sleeve. The man jumped in surprise and frowned down at him. "What is it, boy?" The man asked gruffly, eyes running over the strangely jeweled boy. Sunny suppressed the urge to ram his fingers into the human's eye sockets. "I'm looking for some ninja." A hidden village." "Tell me where it is." The man eyed him and snickered. "You lookin' to be a ninja? You're a little too pretty for that." "Perhaps." Yes, he wanted to kill this human, and couldn't help the killing intent that passed through his eyes. The man swallowed, then pointed back the way he had come. "There's the hidden village of grass about 20 miles west from here. You're going the wrong way." He tried to tug his arm away but found that Sunny's grip was like iron. Sunny nodded and released the man, sneering as he watched him stumble away, throwing looks of fear over his shoulder. Sunny then gazed into the west, frowning in thought. So he had been going the wrong way the whole time. He sighed and kneeled down on his heels, pulling out some leaves and munching idly away, pondering what to do. It was obvious that he would have to go back the way he had come to find this hidden village of grass, but just the name made he grimace. How could a village be hidden in grass? Was the grass as high as trees? Wouldn't that make it rather conspicuous either way? Sunny heaved another sigh and returned to standing, and followed the man in the direction he was sure he had gone. Younglings ran across his path, giggling, then stopping to stare in awe at the youth. Sunny leered at them, and watched as they scampered away, squealing in delight. He kicked a pebble and wandered down the path, going east but not really deciding where to go. Some of the smells offended him, while others pricked his interest. He gazed at the strange stalls that held the disturbingly burned meats. He hadn't understood why Mayu had put almost all of her food under fire, burning out the juices in her meat every time, one of the reasons he never ate her food. Sunny left the village feeling unsatisfied and agitated. When he was within a mile of the village, a familiar and rather recent scent came his way. It was the human that had given him directions. Sunny smiled. The man was humming to himself, a pack strapped to his back. Sunny clicked in excitement, feeling hunger lace through his body. Feeling something behind him, the man turned and staggered in alarm. "What are you doing here, boy? Are you following me?" he asked nervously, backing away from the youth, eyes searching feverishly for a witness. "Hungry," Sunny replied and took another step toward the man. I don't have food." The man gasped, not completely understanding why the child frightened him so. "You are food," the boy hissed, and Sunny leaped forward and drove his fingers into the man's eyes and into his brain. The human dropped like a rag doll, the scent of his blood coming like a salty fragrance. Sunny bent down and punched through his chest, crashing through his ribs and gripping the warm heart, tearing it from the chest cavity. As he feasted on the human, he sat down and crossed his legs to get more comfortable. When he finished the heart, he began to move onto a leg. He was hoping to rebuild his reserves, pack up enough energy in case he had another moment like the time after. He felt the demon approaching to his right, and immediately his senses ran over the demon. In moments he could see a small blue light, the size of his hands, float from between the grass, to hover near him. Sunny remained sitting, eyeing the demon, trying to sense whether it was hostile or not. Though the pack had been the only demons he had ever seen, he was aware that unlike humans, demons come in every shape and size, some with no physical form while others were like the earth itself. At least, that was what Ka had told him. The blue light flickered, then flashed bright, causing Sunny to blink rapidly. When sight returned, he stared in amazement at the large blue wolf that stood regally at his side. Black eyes trained on him spoke of age and wisdom. What is a forest dweller doing out here so near the humans? Sunny raised eyebrows and held out the leg that he was holding in an offering. He could tell that this demon was older than Crick, who was 7 centuries before he had died. His voice that echoed in Sunny's mind was soft with wisdom and patience. The demon glanced down at the body, then at him. How unwise of you to slaughter a human so near its own dwelling. His gaze lifted in the direction of the village. But then, it has been so long since I have tasted the flesh of humans. He took a step toward the limb and took it in his powerful jaws, crunching the bones, savoring the meat. So sweet. Together they dined in silence, Sunny surprised when the demon wolf devoured the intestines and other less savory organs. He only ever ate arms, legs, heart, and for extra blood, the liver. Intestines, kidneys, and other organs were more of an acquired taste, especially with humans, they eat so much crap. When the meal was finished, the demon turned to him. So what brings a young forest dweller out here on the wide open plains? Sunny shrugged and licked his fingers, aware that his face was smeared with blood. As if hearing his thoughts, the demon leaned forward and began to lick his face. Sunny endured, images of Crick licking him flashing through his head, or Mayu wiping his face with a wet cloth when he returned from a good meal. When the wolf was done with his face, he moved on to his hands. Some humans called ninja killed my pack with their source. The demon wolf moved away, stretching the muscles in his neck, ripples flowing through his muscles. Yes. The source, also known as Chakra. I know of humans and their source. Sunny nodded. I'm going to learn how to use it like they do. Then I'm going to destroy them all. But first I must find one of their hidden villages. The demon wolf's indigo fur rustled in the wind as the coal-like eyes gazed at him. You know, only the great ones wielded the source. It was said that at one time, we ruled these lands. The great ones, our masters, they were almost unbeatable, with infinite power, grace, and fury. The humans were no match for such perfection. And yet, not too long ago a hidden village defeated one of our greatest masters, our only nine-tailed fox demon. A wistful look passed over his furred face. Just to be in his presence. So much power. The demon looked down at him. Anyway, if you are looking to learn from some powerful ninja, it is best to go to Fire Country and find its hidden village. I'm sure if they could wield the source better than a master, then they must be the best ninja the humans have to offer. Sunny nodded, eyes wide as the demon turned and began to fade into the grass. Hey, wait! Sunny stood up and stared in chagrin as the demon wolf burst into the small blue flame and disappeared into the grass. Just keep going east. I am sure you'll know when you hit Fire Country. I look forward to what you shall bring to demonkind. Good luck, forest dweller. Sunny scratched his head and shrugged before continuing east toward this Fire Country. Hatake Kakashi turned the page and grimaced to see that it was blank and that he had finished the book with a week left before arriving in Konoha. The world is cruel. He sighed and lowered the book, glancing at his team as they silently walked the deserted path back home. They were considerably more relaxed after they had entered familiar territory, especially after the ordeal that had taken place a week before. The events of Wave Country had changed Team 7 with various results, with a few more pros than cons. They had grown closer as a team, though Sasuke remained as stoic as he possibly could without showing the great effort he was putting into it. On the other hand, Kakashi could rightfully predict that as soon as they returned to Konoha, Sasuke would throw himself into rigorous training, judging by how much brooding he was currently doing. At the moment he had his hands stuffed in his pockets with his eyes focused on the dirt path, probably wondering what he had to do to get to the level as the Haku child had been. Slightly behind him was Sakura, who was alternating between staring at the Uchiha and rubbing her hands together forlornly. The events of Wave had shaken her confidence in herself, and perhaps opened some doorways to self-evaluation, judging by the occasional glances she was sending the boys. She hadn't done much during the battles, but he was beginning to believe that she was merely a late bloomer, and that perhaps she would have some type of epiphany, something that would make her want to be a better kunoichi, at least. Then there was Natsu, who seemed unchanged by any of the events, which wasn't really shocking. He was starting to believe that the boy was imperturbable. Natsu, like Sakura, came from a small family of non-shinobi, and it was actually a wonder as to why he had even chosen the profession when no one in his family looked upon it with favor. But he was also one of the better students, decent chakra control, a willingness to learn, and a friendly easygoing attitude. Though he didn't like to play favorites, Natsu was his most enjoyable student. Kakashi chuckled as he remembered Sasuke's frustration when the Uchiha had learned that his new teammate had very little in the competitive nature. He had tried to spark some kind of rivalry with the boy, but Natsu had ignored his attempts, or hadn't noticed them. The dirty blonde had eventually gained the respect of both his teammates and had shown perseverance during the previous battles. Though Sakura had shed many tears over the demise of Momochi Zabuza and his student Haku, Natsu seemed only slightly sad but mostly accepting. Hey Sakura-chan. When we get back, we should celebrate our first B-rank mission and go out to eat. Sakura brightened and sent some glances Sasuke's way. Yeah! That would be a great idea. Do you want to come, Sasuke-kun? Natsu turned warm brown eyes on his dark-haired teammate. Yes, Sasuke. Why don't you join us? It's been a while since we had a decent meal. Not saying Tsunami didn't know how to cook a meal, but I'm hoping for something that isn't fish-oriented when we get back. Sasuke glanced back at them and gave an HN as a reply, causing Kakashi to drift into the conversation. Actually, that sounds like a good idea. Maybe we can go over new training techniques while we dine. If Sasuke had the ears of a dog, they would have perked right up at the words, training techniques. He shrugged and muttered an, I guess so, that had Sakura beaming and Natsu chuckling in amusement. Kakashi flipped the book to the beginning and prepared to experience the story all over again when he felt a spike of chakra in the distance, one that made his spine stiffen and his head to snap up in alarm, eyes darting here and there. Natsu and Sakura were talking pleasantly, Sasuke was staring at the dirt, and he let his senses run. But the spike had gone as quickly as it had come, and yet, it left him feeling quite clammy. He moved closer to his team, and was aware that Sasuke was now eyeing him, then the surrounding forest. Good. That was two sets of eyes watching out for whatever was coming. And he knew, something was coming. He wasn't sure at the time what the demon had meant when it had said that he would know when he hit fire country, but it was like there had been a simple line drawn in the dirt, and the moment he stepped over it, he knew. He was in fire country. It first hit him like a warm wind that seeped through his veins and caused the blood to rush to his head. His knees began to tremble and his legs buckled beneath him, dropping him to the dirt. In the next moment, he was sobbing, fingers digging into the dirt, tears of laughter streaming down his face. The smell of the earth, the taste of the air, and the feel of the grass, it was all familiar to him. He knew this place, it was like he was home, as if he had been in the wrong place for so long and now had just returned. He was sure he had never been this far east before, and yet, he knew he was home. Sunny stopped his bawling and wiped his rosy face in embarrassment. He didn't know why he was crying, why these foreign emotions had suddenly spilled out of him, but he let his head drop back and drink in the warm sun and the familiar air. This was his place, his lands, and he didn't know why he knew this. He didn't know why he knew that 750 miles from this exact spot there was a deep underground cave that he missed, or that there were miles and miles of forest just beyond his sight. Sunny took in a deep breath and began to sprint toward the trees, legs rejoicing at the exercise, lungs expanding gratefully. His pace was fast but light, leaving minimal footprints like the pack had taught him. When the first tree came into sight, Sunny pulled the source to his legs to make that extra long leap and landed gracefully into the embrace of the forest. He weaved in and out of the branches, swinging from tree to tree as he had seen the monkeys do in the deepest darkest forests. The birds flew from the trees in terror, and squirrels and other small animals dropped to the forest floor in a mad attempt to escape his presence. It was one of the reasons they had stayed so far from human dwellings. Fleeing animals always alerted them when a predator was nearby, but when it was such a large mass of animals, it always made humans real edgy. It always amazed him that Mayu never noticed the sudden lack of animals near her home, and he hoped that the humans of this hidden village would be just as stupid. He felt them in mid-leap, the humans with the source, maybe several miles south of him. He landed on a branch and became still, red eyes half open as let his senses search over them. There were 4 of them, that he knew, and all of them had the source, though it varied between the 4 of them. But one of them had a large amount of it, and he assumed this one must be the leader. They were headed in the same direction as he was, east, and he made a quick decision. It would look better if he arrived with ninja, surely he could charm them into taking him in if he did his absolute best to appear human. His eyes bled to blue, and he ground his teeth together to get them to look as human as possible as he turned south. Now is his chance. 20 minutes later, the omen of bad feelings intensified as Team 7 watched a large mass of birds soar above the trees, twittering and screeching madly as they flew south, several different species going together. Sakura and Natsu ahead and ahead, while Kakashi glanced behind them to spot several kinds of foraging animals cross the path in the same mad dash as the birds. Natsu began to call out several species of birds, pointing at them and completely oblivious to the reason of the mass flight. Then all was silent as Kakashi and Sasuke both drew out their kunai. Something's coming, Sasuke muttered, and both teammates jumped in surprise when they realized the meaning of the spectacle. They immediately pulled out shuriken and kunai. In moments, the only sound that presided in the area was that of the leaves brushing against one another as the wind blew through them. A figure dropped from a tree, and as Sakura screeched, Sasuke threw his kunai at the figure, which quickly moved its head out of the way and watched as it lodged into the tree. Then it turned with blue eyes and a charming smile, the scent of peppermint in the air. Good afternoon. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.